Good morning and welcome to Frank's School. This is the 6th year, 112th day, first video, and I'm calling this Hydra in my head Lurks. That makes Hydra sound somewhat sinister or evil, and in a way, I think you could certainly say that. That's not completely wrong. Up until now, as I've been trying to, please remember, I'm trying to identify and locate the sources of these different ideas that I say are different and actions that I have made. I'm trying to locate them and identify them. I'm not trying to offer you memoirs or an autobiography. But since I'm going in chronological order, it's beginning to seem a little bit like that. And in many ways, it could seem almost like, well, this has been a success story. You've done fine. And this is all normal. What's so different? Well, you'll see. Hydra lurks. Anyway, my mother, Barbara Camp Antonson, kept her dad's last name in her official name. My grandfather, CBA, Cortland Bernard Antonson, my father, they were sources. All of that's quite normal. I mean, it's wonderful. Your grandfather, your mother, your father, they influence your thinking. Yes, sure. I wanted to add about him. I had said that he was charming. I'm quite sure that he was president of the student council at Penn State when he was there. And he was also athletic. He was quite athletic. And I know he played lacrosse when he was at Penn State. I think he might have been captain of the lacrosse team there as well. And he was extremely moral. I don't know if I stressed that enough. He tried to live a moral life, and this was especially towards women. His attitude toward women was that women were I don't want to say sacred, but they deserved profound respect. I was reminded of this when I saw Joe Biden's, the way he reacted to the way Donald Trump talked about and had acted toward women and stuff. Biden was offended to his very depth. And that's the way my father would have been too. I took it on. Practically to a fault, because, there came a point with that kind of thinking where women were not actually flesh and blood. They were like goddesses or something. That's something that came out of the Middle Ages and Romanticism. Anyway, I should include that. Now, Barbie is my youngest sister, and she also was affected by these two in a similar way to me. The other sisters and cousins, not so much so, but my cousin Nina as well. Would have been my oldest cousin. She's the daughter of Helen, Barbara's sister. She also was affected in many ways, certainly by the love of the property and etc. And I was thinking about that. I had between my siblings and my cousins, there were 10 of them, 3, and 4. There were 10 of them, so, and I was the only, they were all girls. I was the only boy. Of the cousins and siblings, the 11 of us total, I was the only boy, which maybe says a good bit, I don't know. All right, my favorite book at this time, this is basically while I was still in high school, was Mysterious Island. I used to think, I ought to have a favorite book, and this was my favorite book by Jules Verne. And I could see in it the beginning of something which I guess I'll call generalist, the idealization of somebody who was a generalist, was not just a fantastic musician or fantastic writer or something, but was spread out. Later on, late in life, I learned the word polymath, and I also eventually learned the word Renaissance man much later. But already by, say, 9th grade, I was being influenced by that idea. The hero of Mysterious Island was an engineer. I think for my simplicity's sake, I'm going to start erasing a bunch of this stuff. So I had a favorite book too. Another book that I'll mention at that time, it wasn't a major thing in my high school curriculum, but we read The Hidden Persuaders. And it affected me too. Much later, much more than I realized at the time. But The Hidden Persuaders was about advertising and really the sinister effect that advertising had and could have, and so it's worthy of mention. I'm not saying it was a favorite book of mine, but it was an influencer. You might recall from the last video my conversation with my father about advertising. I regard it really as quite a sinister thing. All right, let me leave that for later. That's a little harder to talk about. I got interested in German. I was a little surprised. I went to a summer school, St. Paul's school in summer school. It was a private school in Concord, and I studied German, and I was a little bit surprised that my mother supported that idea. That she thought that was okay because her brother had been killed by Germans in World War II. And that wasn't that far back. Why German? Well, that was that reaching out. While I was in high school, I studied French and Latin and Spanish on my own. I was very interested in languages in general. But German was a whole different ballgame, and I wanted to explore it. And I especially want to mention that now because here late in life, German has become so important to me that I can speak it. And I have German friends, etc. Now, an enormous influential was a teacher, 10th grade teacher named Doc Blanchard. Doc was his nickname, Richard Oscar Blanchard. He affected many, many people. He's one of those teachers who was just, out of hundreds, he stood out. And I guess my father disapproved, I think, of his effect on me. Because for one thing, my father sort of hoped I'd be an engineer. That was sort of the hero of the day, of the decade in the 1950s, were the engineers putting, man into space and building rockets to fire at Russia and stuff. The engineer, and I could have been, but Doc ended up swaying me so that eventually, by the time I got to college, and there at Harvard, they made you spread out a little bit at first. Humanities, social studies, and social sciences, and natural sciences. They divided their whole curriculum into those three. And you had to take something and everything and then choose. And humanities is where I went. Incredibly influential. Even in what I'm doing in the prisons right now, Doc, I'm pretty sure, had done that, played the organ in the local prison. Incredibly influential. I have a Facebook friend right now whom I barely remember. From high school, who was in my same class, and she knows exactly what I mean, how influential he was. Another guy that I actually associate a little bit with Doc is Dudley Loftman. So different, though. Dudley Loftman was purposefully simple in his life. He lived not in Concord, but out in Canterbury, in a poor little house he built. And he had come at one point to speak to the youth group. I guess he was sort of a local celebrity in some ways. He called square dances and played the fiddle. And I remember his little talk that he gave about why he was doing what he did. As I say, he was like a local celebrity. And he was saying, well, he was from Massachusetts, and he could remember as a boy that some guy came in to sell him firewood, I think, and he smelled like wood smoke. And Dudley loved that smell. And that night, he didn't even know how he was going to get home. It was probably 10 miles or more to his home, and he didn't know how he was going to get home. I don't think he had a car. And I gave him, my girlfriend and I gave him a ride home and had some garbage tea at his house. That's what he used to call it. So anyway, that's maybe the first that I ran into that purposeful simplicity, kind of a rejection. Now, confirmation. In the Lutheran Church, and the Catholic Church too, they call it, there's another word for it in the Catholic Church. Can't think of it. Anyway, you have to be confirmed at a certain point. You get baptized at birth and then you get confirmed. And that was a problem for me because I found myself called upon to basically take the oath that I would always be a Lutheran, and I could not do that. I could not do that. And at that point, I began to explore. I looked into what are the other religions. Before I would promise something like that, I want to know what they are. It eventually, I got affected by India, a lot more, I think, than maybe I even realized. In all this exploration, I read a biography of Gandhi in like 8th or 9th grade, was very impressed. And finally decided really that I was probably a Hindu. Of all the stuff, to the extent that somebody not from India could be a Hindu, that's probably what I was. Not a Buddhist, not the other things, but I was probably a Hindu. Now, what do you do with that? Now, I think I was in 10th grade when one of my girlfriends, or my principal girlfriend of high school, told me I should read the book The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, which I did. And there it was kind of clinched. I said, yes, that's so. Right to this day, although I'm the organist in a Lutheran church, and you know, most people would think, well, he's a Christian, he's a Protestant, he's a Lutheran, or a closet Mennonite, and so I'm a Hindu. But as a Hindu, I have no issue mostly in attending those churches. So that is, and now you know that connection to India had happened before with people, like in New England, the Transcendentalists had been there. The Beatles in the 1960s, you know, ended up drawn in that direction. Their experience was certainly different from mine, but this made a schism within my family, this confirmation. I failed to be confirmed. They even took me before the bishop, I think, at one point, different state, and said, no, if he won't, cat, you can't do that. If he won't take that oath, he can't be confirmed, and so it was. And they eventually left the Lutheran Church and went to the Congregational Church, eventually to the Unitarian Church. They did. All right, anyway, December 1963, my grandfather died. And when that happened, it wasn't instantly, but at that point, I call it the first inheritance war began. Because that love of this land, of his ranch, the camp ranch it was called, of the ranch, that love spread all through the family, especially through Helen and Mom. And so now, for years, I witnessed this fighting out. At first it was kind of a Cold War, but it got more and more vicious because neither one of them wanted to give it up, and ultimately it was divided. But that will be the subject of another matter. But you know, while Mom and Dad and Helen and her husband George, while they sort of fought all this stuff out, we children were kind of helpless with it. Well, we just had to witness it. So that dominated about the next 10 years almost for me. All right, bye for now.